Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of the Great Work Launchpad. My name is Chris Nelson. My site is evolveconsciousness.org. And this is the Great Work Launchpad, episode 12, Shadow Work Part 10. And we're doing Learn How to Think. And this will be the second part in Learn How to Think. Got a first part done last week. We went up to emotional intelligence and was joined by Brendan Spencer. And so there's still more to get into. And I'm just setting up the Video Ninja for any potential guests to connect and contribute to this discussion. And if you're in the chat, well, you can also contribute to the topic of discussion that way. So here is the link. So if anyone, there we go. So if anyone wants to join, feel free to join. So the Great Work Launchpad is to help people get initiated into the great work, right? It's a rocket ship, you're launching. So how do you launch? How do you do the great work? The symbol Mark Passio created for the idea of the effort to do the great work. And so we're trying to get people initiated and get over the blockages that come with that effort. When you're in the know to some degree, or you're in that process, there is eventually a calling to, just as you received information, well, you also need to put out information as others did for you to receive it. Because it's not a world and a history of no one speaking, no one putting out information. The history that came before you was that people did put out information in whatever form, whether you read it through a book or listened to it in a podcast or a vidcast or a documentary or something. You came across the information because someone put it out. They took the time to learn themselves and then create some content for you to take in, make sense of, and inform your worldview and affect your self-view potentially. So that's what we're trying to do. Get people to do the same. Instead of just a one-step process coming in, that you're engaging in that feedback generation with reality, and you're also outputting for people to take in so that they can output, for more people to take in, to more people to output, and on it goes. Hey, Brandon, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me, as always.
Thanks for being here, as always. Yeah,
That's,
so what?
'cause that's what it's all about. Making that sacrifice, showing, that you care, doing what a lot of people don't want to do, and, still trying to, help morally educate and try to get people to, think. And yeah.
Yeah, that's what this continuing part of Learn How to Think, helping to get people to understand how to think and the blockages to that. So last week, talked about causality of why, talking about problem solving. That's what learning how to think is. We're trying to solve problems. There's a problem, trying to get a solution. So it's all about getting to the truth of something so that you understand the problem and then you can apply a solution to it. And yeah, from there we talked about importance of having truth and of being right, and the problem with authorities and experts and people delegating or appealing to the expert or the authority and not engaging in the process of thinking for themselves, because it's easier to just pass off that responsibility to another who will then tell you what is real, what is true, how reality works, and what's your place in it, what you're supposed to do. So examples of that were government. That's the biggest example, but it's not just government where they're in a position of what people view as managing and controlling and helping society stay ordered and organized so that things don't turn into absolute chaos, because people are so dumb, or people think this, people are so dumb, but I'm one of those people, so I'm so dumb too, and I'm just a child, an incompetent child, and we need this subsection of incompetent children to become managers, because apparently they're not incompetent children. They're the only adults in society who can tell the rest what to do and how to manage their lives, because obviously you can't manage your own life. What are you, an adult? No, you're not an adult. You're a stupid child, an irresponsible child. So obey, do what you're told, and be a good kid, and you'll get your dessert. You'll get your treats. Um, Bark and sit when you're told to, and all that kind of stuff. But that's the major one that people don't really think about too much. And there's also there's everything else that people delegate authority to. The science is expert in this, expert in that, whatever, and could be anything. It could be home decor, landscaping. Someone tells you, well, this is what you got to do. Well, maybe there's a better way that they're not aware of, and So obviously, if you don't have the knowledge, then you're gonna delegate to their expertise, and you'll take their suggestions in and probably do what they suggest, unless you get the information from elsewhere. But you can always do your own thinking and figure things out, and that's especially true when it comes to issues of your health and your body and the medical system. That's where you should really pay more attention to what is being said and what you're going to do based on someone's information, as opposed to something more trivial like landscaping or decorating or whatever. So that was authority, and then we got into emotional mind control, and we'll pick up from there. And I was going, I think last week, I went into the psychological aspect of how we're influenced, and we have ideas, and there's imagery created, and there were poets and storytellers in the past, and theaters, and by people speaking things, it creates a representation of some aspect of the world within your mind, and you can create them and destroy them at will. So it's like creating multiverses, different versions you can project into the future for something that didn't happen, and create a timeline that doesn't yet exist. And you can create multiple of those timelines, and then you can choose which action you think will create the timeline that you think is most optimal for you or for the situation or whatever. And so with that, the power to influence other people is especially important when we're going to be talking about emotions, because that's how a lot of people, that's basically how you make decisions. And I'll go into some articles. I read a few things many years ago that exemplify this. So one of them relates to the backfire effect, and this is where, if you're going to present facts, what tends to happen is people get hardened in their positions. You're like, I'm going to present a logical argument, and the logic will speak for itself. The truth will speak for itself because of the logical consistency of the argument. And people are reasonable, and they're smart, and they're logical. Obviously this isn't the person that thinks people are dumb and they need to be ruled over, but they are actually that person because they vote for government. So even though they don't think of it in one time, they're in a cognitive dissonance of thinking two opposite things at the same time, because their ultimate conclusion is that people need to be ruled because they're too stupid, or it wouldn't work without them because they're unable to rule and run their own lives. But then at the same time, you go, oh yeah, people are logical. We present logical argument. I'm expecting them to. This would be more, I guess, the left-brained people, where they're like, oh yes, logic, and just use logic, and we'll present it, and obviously they'll just accept it because it's logical, and but then at the same time they're voters and whatnot. So you present something, but you're not taking into account other things like biases, the anchoring effect, where the first information
Mhm.
they come across, they latch onto if they have attachments and identifications with other information they've taken in that has now formed their self-view or their worldview. It's been concretized and become a foundational aspect of how they view themselves in the world, where they're not going to want to let go of it. And when you're presenting this, it's um, it's going to be perceived as an attack upon them because you're presenting something that's going to contradict what they've accepted as being true. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to get them to, you know, admit wrong. And that's the thing that's really hard for people to do, is admitting wrong, because they're so attached to their falsity that they don't want to admit wrong, because what you're presenting, no matter how logical it is, they're in that emotional side of, they are attached, they are identified with that thing that they don't want to let go of, that you think you're going to be able to, like, yeah, I'll just present you with the facts and here's the truth and here's the logic, and you're just going to let go of it. And well, it doesn't work out. It doesn't often work out. It can work out if someone has done enough internal work and understands that process, and they can be more objective. But people aren't objective by default. There's emotions that are needed. Often you can get people convinced of things and influence them and change minds by personally relating something to you, or relating to the information themselves. Or one of the techniques is to feel like their position is heard, so that then they are willing to hear your position and feel like you accept some of their position, at least some of it, so that then they are willing to accept something. Because then it opens them up through, this is like emotional manipulation, um, but it's part of the biases that people have. So you influence them by getting them to like you. And that's one way people can be deceived by charlatans and con men, of flattery and saying nice things, and people have an affinity towards you by making them feel good. So they feel good, well, that's emotional. And when you listen to them or agree with their position, and then you're like, oh, well, have you considered this? And then they're going to be more willing to listen to you instead of being calcified and reject it. So there's all these techniques to get people to be more receptive to information, to let their guards down and not be on automatic defense, defending their positions, no matter how wrong they are. Because we aren't objectively minded by default. That is something we have to learn to apply as a mindset. It's a mindset that we have to hone and develop and apply in situations. It takes time for people to face things apart from that immediate reaction to reject or accept things. They're not trained how to think, and all these things to get them to be more open to consider things or accept what is you can demonstrably, well, you can demonstrate as truth. These are all mental and emotional gymnastics, all these psychological things that you have to weave around, and instead of just saying the truth, which is,
Yeah.
that's my preferred method. But yeah, um, go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, because sometimes just being direct with people, it works for some people, but then some people, don't. And yeah, you got to kind of have those mental gymnastics to, kind of get a feel for where their mindset is at, and to, get a feel for where their emotions are, like what are, the biases. And you don't have to play that game. You can just be, the forceful person, who's very direct. It's up to you. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of blockages within the individual that's going to prevent them, or somewhat deter them from taking in those new bits of information. Because how, like you said, when you engage with these individuals, when you're bringing that new information toward them, they have this barrier that's up. And man, you had a slide where you kind of had like a force field, and you speak truth to people. People who have that barrier up, it just kind of bounces off compared to somebody who's open minded. Has critical thinking skills, done some you know her moderate of shadow work. When you bring them new information, they'll take it in. They may not deny it and they don't he'll accept it, but they're willing to take the responsibility to go and discern and go through those parameters to decide for themselves if it's true or not. So that's what we are dealing with because, like you're talking about two different frequencies. So the individuals who have those barriers up, those blockages, when when you start talking, they'll listen to everything, but once it goes against their belief system, one that goes against their, their dogmatic, false axioms, then they'll start tuning out, start trying to escape, have the conversation. So you know the art of persuasion, is what I always like to call it, is something that we all do to a degree, but some people do it better. And that's what we see a lot of people falling victim to, is they're being persuaded, they're being influenced, from an emotional level. Because if you look into the true art of persuasion, or like NLP, a lot of it's tailored toward building have rapport from an emotional level, so you can relate to them, then you can sell them some bullshit or sell them some BS idea. Yep, that's the slide. Yep, her right there.
Yeah, I turned on my AC. I don't know if it's too hard. This is a directional mic, so I don't think it'll be
Oh no, you're good.
too much. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like 100, 104, 106 today with the humidity, so it was really hot.
just wait, hold on, just real quick, Chris. You are a warrior because I'm like you. I was forced to turn my AC on like 2 weeks ago because my inside thermometer was like 98, and that's without the humidity was like 100. So yeah, hell, I totally understand.
Yeah, I turned it off just when I started, and then well, I got 15 minutes in, and I'm like, whoa,
Yeah,
I'm not gonna
yeah, it's
last an
just too
hour.
hot.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
way too hot. Um, yeah, so that's an interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't even think of this aspect of the interference, and it creates tension, and that's a catalyst for change. And that's one of the things in this backfire effect. When you if you research it, one of the someone a political scientist for I think a study says the general idea is that it's absolutely threatening to admit you're wrong. Um, the phenomenon known as backfire is a natural defense mechanism to avoid that cognitive dissonance. So I could bring in my cognitive dissonance chart. That's what I was saying, is that the you're someone accepts something, but you're giving them new information, and automatically there's a conflict. There's well, I have this information and this new information, but they're not logically consistent. There's a contradiction, and then they can either just whatever dismiss the new information or not even think about it. But there is that conflict. And then you have these emotional cues, as I put in that chart, and there's the opportunity where people can change their mind. Um, so this is when we have conversations with people. We can have this friction, this tension, this pressure, and this conflict when we interfere with different levels of like a frequency. So I have blue and red with like a wavelength in a circle. Higher wavelength is more frequent, lower wavelength is lower. So the red is lower and the blue is higher. So yeah, just wanted to add that since you mentioned it. Good point. And yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, that tension in and of itself is not a bad thing. People need to understand that. That's that chaos that's that's capable of creating change. So people shouldn't be afraid to kind of go there, because that's going to be that alchemical process, that first step, that that fire to hopefully try to, you know, to plant that seed to to get them to listen. So if you were engaged in a conversation and things kind of get to that point, you can back down, but you can keep pushing forward because tension, that pressure that force is a means for change, and that can be a good thing. So a lot of people, back away from confrontation. You shouldn't be. And I'm not saying, push it to the push, push it to where it gets, violence, but force, pressure is what we need, because that is what creates change. That's the element of chaos that we talked about earlier, that we shouldn't run from, because that's what's going to be diving into the unknown, and that's what we are talking about. So that little friction is a much needed friction, because friction is also, it's simply energy. And that energy is what can lead the individual to possibly, start to take in and comprehend the information. Then they can go down and start their own journey.
Yeah, that's the. And we're not talking about chaos as immorality, not that type of chaos as as a good thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it's the contrast with a discomfort from you're comfortable. You're comfortable with how you see the world, even though there's falsity in it, you don't even know it. So, there's it's a necessity because, in that process of cognitive dissonance, you have to have one thing that opposes the other thing. There has to be a contradiction. It's not harmonious. So until you receive that new information, everything is harmonious and there's no contradiction, and everything's good with the world. But you're comfortable, but you have falsity that you're attached to. You don't see the world correctly as it is. Your map doesn't match the territory. So this tension is an automatic process of that cognitive dissonance healing method, and it's absolutely necessary to have that bit of chaos. Um, yeah, I'm gonna read part of an article I read. I guess it was in 2012, and it's titled "Decisions are largely emotional, not logical." And people might think, well, no, you use logic to make your decisions. That's one part of it in an optimal capacity, but in the end, it's emotion, and this gets at the heart of my trivium charts with the trinity of consciousness, and the trivium is care, because it's as logical as you want to be. Um, in the end, it's what you desire, what motivates you, that's going to bring you to your decision. So even outside of moral issues or whatever, it could be like, what do you want to do? Well, a want is a desire. And if you go at it from a logical only aspect, well, then if you don't want anything in the end, then it doesn't matter how accurately you analyze or use logic. You're not going to do anything with it, because in the end, you have to know what you want to do for your logic to get you to that goal, to that end. And so I'll just read a bit here. Many negotiators, right? So then you're presenting. I'll just read from the start. Think of a situation where you had bulletproof facts, reason, and logic on your side, and believed there was absolutely no way for the other person to say no to your perfectly constructed argument and proposal. To do so would be impossible, you figured, because there was no other logical solution or answer. And then the other side dug in their heels and refused to budge. And that's the backfire effect. No one was swayed by your logic. You may be confused. This is where negotiators, where they think that they're armed with facts and logic, and then, what is it, an iRobot with Will Smith, that AI was like, my logic is undeniable. My logic is undeniable, but it was like
yeah,
totally wrong. Anyways, because it's a stupid AI. So you're doomed to fail because decision making isn't logical, it's emotional. And according to the latest findings in neuroscience, this was in 2012. So there's this, a few years ago, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio made a groundbreaking discovery. He studied people with damage in part of their brain where emotions are generated. He found that they seemed normal, except they were not able to feel emotions. So that's happened where even the opposite way, where people's like the corpus callosum is like cut, they have a brain injury,
Yeah.
and one part of their brain works. Like you can look at this woman online who had only the right brain, and she had her left brain cut off because she had a stroke, and she
Mm.
couldn't like think of anything. The information was coming in, people were talking, but she was just saying garbage coming out, and she couldn't make sense of it. And anyways, it's a funny story, even though it's like horrible. And she managed to get out of it, but at the time, you must be freaking out. So the opposite is the right brain damage, or right brain is not there, and you only have left brain. So he studied these people, and he found that they seemed normal, but they couldn't feel emotions, and they had something in common. They couldn't make decisions. They could not make decisions, and they could describe what they were doing in logical terms. Yet they found it very difficult to make even simple decisions such as what to eat, because what you eat is based on what
Mm.
you want to eat. So they couldn't even decide what to eat because that's what you want, and that's what you desire and you care for, and then you're going to make a decision from that. So many decisions have pros and cons on both sides. Shall I have bread, or shall I have whatever, broccoli or whatever? So there's no rational way to decide. These test subjects were unable to arrive at a decision. So, yeah, I won't read the rest there. There's a few more paragraphs, but that's just to emphasize the point that emotional mind control is a barrier, but it's also like emotions can be a barrier, but they're also necessary. So we shouldn't, oh, well, emotional mind control, shun emotions. No, you need your emotions. You just need to engage in that proper balancing and that feedback between your thoughts and emotions so that you can come to more logical decisions as opposed to just emotional decisions or irrational decisions or instinctual decisions or reactionary decisions. Just react instead of taking the time to respond by thinking about things and things like that. And some examples we can give of emotional mind control. Passio's fond in the early podcasts of talking about the order followers. So someone can view their parent, usually like a father in the police or the military, and they can be like, well, my father's a good person. If someone tries to tell them that the police aren't good people, well, the person will be like, well, no, that's nonsense. Why would I bother listening to you? My dad's been nice to me. He does nice things. He works at a charity or whatever, but that's outside of their capacity. But as a whole person, they're not good, because as a whole person, it works as like a truth table. So if you have something that you're doing that is violating people's rights, then overall you're not a good person. You can be doing good things in other capacities, but because you're choosing to receive money to do a certain task, which is inherently wrong, inherently immoral, because you're going to be violating people's rights that you have no right to do so, because they're not initiating harm in order to apply consequences to them. You're preventing them from doing things they have a right to do, or you're making them do things that they shouldn't be doing, and you're making them do wrongs or preventing them from doing rights. You want to say anything about that part?
Yeah. When you was talking about the not being able to decide what to eat, I was thinking about a new ager, who's purged their ego, sort of like that. And then I'm sure you've heard of who Phineas Gage was.
I've heard the name, but it escapes me right now, like what that relates to
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, he was the individual who Jordan Peterson had talked about earlier. In his work, he worked on like the railroads, building railroads, and somehow a metal rod had went through like the right hemisphere part. Where we deal with a lot of like moral judgment, and how and after that, how it completely changed him. So it just kind of talked about like like brain damage and stuff like that. But yeah, he wasn't able to, I guess you could say, like comprehend a lot of moral, decisions. It was his prefrontal cortex on the right side and the frontal lobe. But just to kind of an interesting story if anyone, like he'll just wants to, just look at, what happens. But what we are getting at, yes, this portion about, how logic, knowledge, but logic without care is how dangerous, because care is what's going to generate all of this. Because you can have logic, but without care, then you will hell abuse that logic. You see, care is the initiating part. It's the force that starts this, but it's also needed throughout this whole process, because you can have logic, you can have knowledge, but without care, you won't put the knowledge back out into the world. So even though we're talking about care and how the emotions, which should never be taken off the table, it's just we can't think with our held emotions. So people are trying to substitute logic for the held emotions and bypass that process. Yeah, this was the chart I was thinking about. Care is that generating force that spins this wheel and continues the spinning of the wheel, which creates energy, which creates causality, which causes motion and things to manifest in reality. So yes, care is that pivotal driving point which can't be ignored. And let me see if I had anything else to kind of talk about. Nah. But yeah, that slide right there. Um, yeah, that slide. Yeah, that right there. He'll change my life. Yeah, yeah. This slide changed my life. Possibly one of the most important slides. Yeah, yeah, on the internet right here, because there's so much amalgamated in this one slide.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and I had two. I only put this one, and then there was another one with on here. It had to do with I think it's on the next one, the remade version I did. Yeah, it had the part with reaping, so you experience the effects, and that has to do with the earlier versions where I had oh boy. Well, I guess I don't have it here, but the you that was in my, yeah, the power of consciousness, I think, where I had thought, emotions, and actions, and as like a top down way, and it was you can make choices, but you do not have the choice in the experiencing of effects once a behavior has been created. So it can be your own behavior,
Yep.
but once it's created, those are determinate existence. They're created. So you have random free will that influences existence by your actions. So you sow into reality, and then you reap not only what you create, but what others create.
Yep.
So you're creating an effect, and you affect or influence external reality. And in consequence, you and other people doing that, well, those are determinate existence. They're created, and then they operate with causality, and you have no choice to experience them. So this is where all the power is. This is the internal domain, the cause, and this is the effect, and that's where you're going to reap things, and you're going to experience those effects, and those are going to affect and influence your internal reality, because this is your internal reality, and that's the external reality. This is where you
Yep.
have the universe, the one song, the one verse, the one change, and this is the inside of you, where you can just be totally disconnected from reality, have like this map that's totally crappy. You can create a bunch of worlds inside, and that's your internal reality and the external reality. And the goal is to, have the infographics to align the two. You have to align your perception with reality so that they're in balance as one, ideally, and not have them disconnected in disequilibrium. That brings up symbolism of ma'at as well, with the scales that I can apply in a different way. That the equilibrium between yourself, and ultimately your perceptions are going to lead to your actions. So hence, that's directly the scales of the heart and the feather: truth, existence, reality. And your heart is your cares, what motivated you to do your actions, and if they align, if they're harmonious and equilibrium or not. So another part of this learning how to think is to realize when there's consensus on things. or the majority are saying things, or what's popular, the bandwagon effect, whatever, or whatever the popular person says. Just because they're popular, well, people have an appeal to what the popular people say. Um, Consensus isn't truth. So that's even in the scientific community where, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think he went on to the Del Bigtree's show, and he came out with the statement that um, science is based on consensus. Yeah. So he was
That's
saying,
very dangerous.
yeah, he's saying science. No, you're talking about, science is a process. It's a methodology which is based in the trivium, as I explained. Um, I think it was on Chris Jensen's podcast, Endivo podcast of last week,
Yeah.
where I was talking about how you have an idea of something, so you're going to be like, well, your hypothesis. Well, is that true? Well, let me establish procedures. This is your experiment where you're going to be like A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3. These are your steps, and then you're going to produce some results, and you're going to observe this everything, and you're going to observe the results, and you say, okay, well, this is my hypothesis. What I thought would happen is what happened. What I observed, no. Oh, okay. So maybe the hypothesis is completely wrong, or maybe the methodology, the process, the steps, the experiment that you carried out wasn't done the right way. So then you can modify it, and you can keep trying and trying and trying, and then maybe after you do it many times in different ways, you're like, well, I was sure it was true, but I guess it's not true since I can't find a way to prove it. It might be true, but one way that it isn't true is if you find a process that negates it, and that's one way to surefire demonstrate that something is false is by demonstrating something that is true that contradicts that other thing that you thought was false. And that's one way to prove something to be true by proving, to prove something as false. You can't really prove a negative in itself for that thing, but you can do so by proving something else to be true, which contradicts the other thing that you were thinking was true, because they both can't be true. So if the other thing that you were thinking was true, well, you can't prove it's true yet, but the other thing you can prove it's true, and it contradicts the other thing, well, clearly the other thing can't be true because you just proved something else that is true. So in essence, that proves something else is false. But without that other thing, that secondary thing being proved as true, then you can't prove something to be false. Like if someone says, well, if you can't prove me wrong, well, then I'm right. Well, no, that's not how it works, because it's very hard. You can't prove a negative on something. You have to prove something else is positive, which will contradict the other thing. And then you can prove that it's false. But you can't prove that it's false in itself. You can't prove a negative of that thing itself, the negation. You can only negate it by proving something else is true in existence, and then it'll contradict it and negate it. I can go through. I was talking about the consensus. So truth. So Neil deGrasse Tyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Yeah, he said that where science is based on consensus, and then Del Bigtree was like, "What?" So this was during the COVID times, where, well, scientist says this, so the science, that bullshit that Fauci was talking about, the science says this, so it's true. And then deGrasse Tyson, a so-called scientist, was coming out with this claim, well, that's the consensus, so that's what the science is, and that's what's true, because what the science says is what's true. Well, no, that's just what the majority of scientists believe is true. So that goes for everything. Just because a bunch of people are saying it doesn't mean it's true.
For him to even call it the science is even more ridiculous, because if you put the in front of a word, you're trying to show more importance. Like if someone says, hey, I'm a man, that sounds one thing, but when I say, hey, I'm the man, that sounds like a lot more important. So it's like, man,
I'm the man.
yeah,
That's
But
funny.
I'm glad he got called out, like on his bullshit, because anyone that says some bullshit like that should be called out.
Yeah. And also, solipsism, if you're going to say there is no truth, that it can't be known, can't be communicated, then you say, well, is that even true what you're saying?
Yeah.
If there's no
Yeah.
truth, then is that even true? Then what are you talking about? Shut up and go cry in your corner because you're talking gibberish. It doesn't even make sense what you're saying.
Technically, there's not really a real solipsist person, because when you boil it down to it, they're just, have regurgitating bullshit. No one believes that bullshit because,
Yeah.
I mean, go tell a solipsistic person to go jump off a cliff, because, hey, you can never know, how freaking that you're going to fall. So go try it out. But they
Yeah.
won't ever do that.
No. So I'll go through some of the comments. We were talking about the chaos. Anarcharika said, transmute the chaos. Yeah. And Chris Johnson says, gotta get uncomfortable. That's right. With that cognitive dissonance. And don't want to get too Abrahamy, but until you know what you don't want, you'll never know what you don't want. So yeah, gotta know that's the apophatic path. Know what you don't want, and you can figure out what you do want.
Yep.
This one, Jordan Peterson has literal brain damage. That tracks. And they're like, well, no, we were
Well, he
talking
does.
about the other guy, but
Well, he does now, maybe, because
but
he's not the same person.
yeah, that's why he's saying that he has brain damage, because how can you also be an expert on tyranny and still be a statist? So yeah, I guess there's brain damage there. Consistent results can only exist in an objective reality. If reality was relative, there would be no consistency. Yeah, for sure. So it's objective reality and not subjective reality, whatever you want to make it up, or be a subjectivist or a relativist or a postmodernist or a solipsist, all share many characteristics.
Yeah.
Apophatic reasoning by negating what is not real or false. Con science and can science. Yeah. Put it in a can and sell it to everybody. It's the mainstream. Just chug it down.
Yes, you can.
So this brings us to the big topic of the trivium. So I've gone into a lot on the trivium. Before this one was, so I have the trivium in reality, language in reality, part 1, modalities of thought, occulting and encrypting reality through word magic, dark negative and limited trivium, logic and addendums. And then after that, when I did metaphysics, language and reality, fundamentals of the trivium, going into aspects of the book on Sister Miriam Joseph, visualizing that in charts. And so what she talked about Aristotelian metaphysics and categorization and predicates. So I did my presentation based on that. And this is one of the first version of my merging of the trivium and the trinity of consciousness. My presentation was called The Circle of Life, but I called it Causality, Consciousness, Trivium, and Logic, Tree, Symbolism initially. And there's a remade version. And then there was this one, which is very bright now with the white background. But I like how it looks. And then I have the remade version, which is more subtle and darker.
Yeah.
And then I came up with this one, which was even more, I guess, detail packed. And that's the one we can get into. And then I remade this one for Funnel 4. Yeah, I remade this one to make it less crowded, I guess, and really show that the parts coming in and the parts coming out. So you feedback
Yeah.
on yourself, but also within reality, that this is like superimposed above it with the shadows and everything, like it was before. But it wasn't as obvious that well, this is red because it's in reality, and this is blue because it's in the internal, the power of consciousness to change, and the primacy of existence for us to be in existence and to have power of consciousness to change anything in existence, well, existence comes first, and then we are in existence. Yeah, so what we're talking about, I have other slides and other presentations getting into our perceptions and the senses, and then we have preconceptions and other stuff. I think that's a bit in my cognitive dissonance chart and reality and processing presentation. So we have existence. What is generated? Before humans existed, there was a universe, there was a world, there were things here. That's what is actually there. And these are the effects. Because they came from somewhere, something else. You can imagine whatever that is. Unified field, the mind of a creator, whatever. Before it existed, it wasn't there. So it came from somewhere. If it works like that or not, we can be like, yeah, I think it does, because it makes sense, because the whole mentalism where we create things, well, it comes in from our mind first, so we transpose that logic through an analogy, and we say, well, for the other things in existence to come about, then probably there was something else, like a mind, that created it, and then it got created initially. So not necessarily that a tree didn't exist until a creator was like, I think of a tree, and then it's going to manifest from my mind. But it could be like, anyways, I don't want to get too much into this, but an origin story could be it created laws and code, as I go into my law of freedom presentation, where there's this stuff in the background of existence that we can't see underlying it all, that dictates how things operate. And these are laws of nature. These are natural laws. So it could have coded this whole biological material universe or whatever, and then press the start button, and then things went on their way. And then eventually it all evolves according to the underlying code. I'm not saying it is code. That's how we can relate to it, by things we do understand. We can try to relate to things that we don't understand and try to make sense of it. So that's what we're doing. We're applying correspondence to try to make sense of things that we don't know the answer to, and we're coming up with ideas to try to say, oh, maybe it operates the same way, and we're going to use similar terminology. So anyways, enough with that sidetrack. So this actuality, the effects, and it's more the effects in relation to this whole chart of how the consciousness is why the effect is generated. So the things we create. So it's more the human world that we have created, the human reality, is there because we have made it this way. There wouldn't be a car if there weren't humans creating cars. There wouldn't be houses, etc., everything. So this is why the effect of the car, the fork, whatever is generated, is because we were the cause to that from consciousness. And this is a potentiality as opposed to an actuality, because a potential to create something in your mind is only a potential until you actualize it with your actions, and then it becomes an actuality. And this is objective reality, and this is subjective reality. So we don't need to go through the reaping and the sowing. We already did that. So these things that exist, they come in as grammar, input, knowledge. And as I have on the previous slide, well, it's the who, what, where, when. Here I just put what to save space. So who, what, where, when. And that comes in as grammar, input, knowledge. These are the three different systems of the trivium. You have grammar, logic, rhetoric. And that's the classical trivium. You have the more modern, computational, symbolic derivation of input, processing, and output. And you have the esoteric version of the trivium, or the ancient version of knowledge, understanding, wisdom. And I find that one, along with the modern one, is the most accurate in terms of a broad way of describing it. Because grammar, I find that's more confusing to talk about it as grammar. People usually think as language. So, and The opposite of this I have in yellow is ignorance. So if you're not taking some things in, you'll have ignorance of it. And then what you don't take in, and you're not using logic and processing that information to understand it, or you end up with confusion about it. If someone asks you a question about something you don't know, or if you're in a situation where you don't have information, you lack information, you're going to be confused about it. And you won't maybe not know what to do, or you'll have a poor decision. And hence poor decision making, well, that's folly, foolishness, as opposed to having wisdom of having good information and having a good action taken. So what I did here, and I hadn't seen anyone do this before I did it in 2014, like I mentioned with, that was my first version, is the trivium, this one, connects with the trinity of consciousness extremely well. And so when I realized this, I was like, hey, I'm going to visualize it, and it, it forms that seal of Solomon, the two triangles, and they fit perfectly with reality, because grammar input knowledge, well, that's coming from out there, an objective reality. It's not coming from your subjective reality. And yes, there's an aspect where you can feedback between your logic and thought and come up with new things, new idea, which constitutes like a new form of knowledge, and you can come up with that. But in general, it all starts from the external reality. And then that comes in to the internal realm in blue, external realm in red, internal realm in blue, and that's your thought, your mind. So you have thoughts, and you think about what came in, the things you see from the day you're born, even before you're born in the womb, there's sounds and things, and that's all leading to influence upon you and how you make sense of the outside world. And so that's the first part of the trinity of consciousness, is thought. So from the first part of the trivium to the first part of the trinity and the trinity of consciousness, then we get to the second part of the trivium, logic, process, and understanding of what you think about, of that input. And you're going to think about it. So you're going to process it with your thoughts. You're going to try to come to an understanding, try to understand it more. And this is the why. This is the power, the causal power of understanding potentially why these things. So as we were talking about at the beginning of this episode and last episode, was we're trying to get at problem solving, trying to get to the truth, because there's a problem, we're trying to come up with a solution. There's a question, we're trying to answer it. And this is why we have to be curious about things and doubt things and question things. Where we have that curiosity, doubt, and question about what comes in. Someone tells you something. Well, is it true? You're going to doubt, you're going to question it. Well, is it really true? You're going to have curiosity, so you're going to go out and potentially look into things yourselves, not just have people tell you things. You're going to look, you're going to go read books, you're going to go through podcasts or videos or whatever. So you're going to process it and try to understand it. And part of that process is the second part of the trinity of consciousness, the emotions, the so-called heart, correlated with the mind. This is where we can develop some true intelligence. And this is a feedback, or I have in my earlier, I put intelligence there and I didn't put feedback because there wasn't enough room. So I put intelligence here between the line connecting them, because there's a feedback where you're going to, like we've been talking about earlier in this episode, where that feedback between what you want, you're going to have a goal, and then you're going to take the information you have to try to achieve your goal. Well, the goal is something you want, something you care about. You're motivated to go towards that, to try to create it. So that goal is going to be something that ultimately you care about, and it's an emotional aspect. And, you could feel a certain way about things, and then you could feedback on you, okay, well, I'm realizing that I'm feeling this way. Well, what does that mean? Logic, processing, understanding, going to try to derive the meaning behind it and the purpose, and try to understand it more within yourself. So self knowledge, and also in the world, and that's the why. And then eventually, with that, as I read from that article, the ability to make decisions. Well, you're going to make a decision, and that's how you're going to do something. So that goal, that end, or understanding how something came into existence, you're going to understand it, and then you're going to act in relation to it, in different ways in the world based on what you came to understand and how you feel about it and how you think about it. And well, those are going to be the actions. So ultimately the third part of the trivium is the third part of the trinity of consciousness, which is your actions. And so the mind, the heart, to the guts or the hands, as I first heard from you, Brandon, in your Lex Naturalis presentation. You changed it to hands, which makes sense since the majority of our actions is with our hands, and the guts is the courage, the will part. So with your will, in the older one, I have it here: courage, intelligence, and will. And I have it's in this one here, yeah. So in that feedback, we have intelligence with the mind, but intelligence with the emotions. But I guess that's more intellect. And then we have the care, and courage, and willpower. And well, this one I put them in a different order. And we have the negative ones as well. We have apathy. So instead of care, you could not care, and that's going to affect your feedback generation in reality, as my subtitle was. You could have dark care. You could care to do immorality, and then that's going to create things in the world that's going to affect other people, because you're going to have dark care instead of true care. Instead of having care for truth that motivates you into wisdom and creates positive things into the world that affects everyone towards more true freedom. Yeah, I guess the last part here, the power of free will, ignorantly or knowingly, works towards creating potentials, good or evil, into reality. Pass it back to you, Brandon.
Now, take everything that Chris just said and look at this slide, and you see where the guts, hand, and action is, and you see the arrow that's pointing outwardly. Now, remember earlier we talked about how when we try to speak truth and bring knowledge toward people, and they have, they kind of have that force field up. So take that part, then he'll apply, because there's going to be grammar and knowledge that's going to be going outward towards somebody else. But when you have that force field up and you have those barriers up and you have that blockage up, you say, no, I don't want that grammar. No, I don't want the input. Then therefore you block it, you cut it off. So that that grammar, that knowledge doesn't penetrate. It doesn't get taken in, from their senses in order for them to start this own process. And that's the problem, is people aren't taking in the grammar because they're blocking themselves off to it. They're cutting, themselves off to it. And that's some of the things, that we talked about earlier, is, you're going to have to go through all of these mental gymnastics, with people, because they're going to have all these barriers. They're going to have all these belief systems. They're going to have all of these things that's going to, cut them off from that initial state of taking in, the grammar. So you can take these slides and then he'll apply it to the first one, and then you'll start to see, and then you'll start to realize, like, hey, okay, this is why people aren't receptive to truth. This is why people aren't receptive to new information, because we have all these barriers. We have all have these blockages. And hell, I mean, you have it laid out right here, because this is how it works. This side is true. It's not true because you're saying it. It's true because I've hell, gone through this process and analyzed it, and taken my data, and I'm putting it back out into the world, just as we all should, to verify. But you will see this and how it fits toward people. And why is it that they don't even get to logic? Why is it they don't even get to hell, the second step within the trivium? Because they don't even take in the grammar and the knowledge. So this feedback loop goes on continuous, because even though hell, we have this one picture, it's this picture is representative of the individual. So apply it to however many individuals, in a given area, and you'll see, there's this feedback pattern, feedback pattern, cause effect, cause effect, cause effect. That's why this information is so important, because this is truly how we consciously create. This right here is truly how we consciously create and build in reality. Yep.
Yeah. So these, as you mentioned, this was another way of I represented it just T, and you're reaping and causes is sowing output in reality, and this is how they're all connected, as you just mentioned that these are all of us are people, and we're feeding back into the web of reality, and those are just like these are the effects going on. Someone could do something over here, and then it takes time for through a chain of causality. The sun's rays, when the earth turns, it takes, what is it, 6 seconds or something for them to reach the earth. So it's not instant, right? There's causality, there's time, there's movement through space. So things people do aren't going to instantaneously affect you. They're going to go through this web of reality, and eventually, someone's going to reap from it. They're going to be affected by it, etc. So there's a force or a field or a web of existence, and a causal interchange between our causal dynamics, our internal causal dynamics, producing the effects in a pattern of reality through our actions and behavior.
That's why it's so crucial. It is so crucial for us to know this information, so we can have the free will choice to decide what we put back out into the world. So crucial. It's pivotal. That's why this knowledge has to be understood, because then you put yourself in a position of power to decide, are you going to put moral actions back out into the world, or are you going to put immoral actions out into the world?
Yeah, this is all empowering information to get you to realize the power you have as an individual. And it's not
Yep.
that you're going to immediately change the world by your own action. It's because that we are aggregately sowing and reaping our collective reality. We're all in this together. Not in the COVID sense, all right? Like that was a popular saying back then, a
I
few
know.
years ago. Our actions affect others, and their actions affect us. As we and others sow, so shall we and others reap in the aggregate. And that's how the law of freedom works. Aggregate morality leads to the level of aggregate freedom. Aggregate immorality determines the aggregate level of immorality. Aggregate level of slavery, sorry. Aggregate immorality to aggregate slavery. Yeah, so I think we can end it there, and we can touch up on the trivium. We'll do a part 3, and we'll get into epistemology, which is what I talked a lot about on Chris Jensen's podcast last week.
Yeah.
He came up with the term, the epistemologistician, I think it was.
Epistemology. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a hard word.
it's
Yeah, because I could usually say, yeah,
epistemology and logistician. So
yeah,
epistemologistician. There you go.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Because I could usually say tongue twisters, but when I saw that word, I was like, oh man, I figured that's a tough
yeah, it's a tough one. You gotta like mull through it before you get it right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, yeah. If anyone hasn't seen the episode, he'll go back and check it out. Yeah, how fantastic.
Yeah, we'll be talking a lot about that in the next episode, the third one, and I think that'll wrap up the learn how to think, because that's the crucial part. We could talk about where's my other thing. See that's by the way, that's my background on my desktop. This is my infographic. There we go. Yeah, so the trivium method it's a process of understanding how your own process of your internal processes work to produce the external processes, and how that influences you, and it keeps going, a feedback generation in reality. But the crucial part is this bottom part in this whole process of learning how to think. That's the epistemological side that we're going to get into deeper next week. So, yeah, I'll say thanks for everyone tuning in the chat. And thanks for your contributions, especially you, Brendan. Thanks for coming by. Always appreciate you coming by and adding your part to the voice of the truth in the series. Much valued. And we'll see you next week for episode 13, lucky number 13, and part 3 of learning how to think. So have a good night, everyone. Take care.